So I'm going to take great pleasure in introducing you to our speaker today, Kiron Bondale. This gentleman is a senior consultant. He's got a string of credentials as long as my arm. I'm not going to read them out and embarrass him. With World Class Productivity, Inc. He has 20 years of experience in both traditional and agile project management. I'm sure he has learned to dance on hot coals at some point. He has set up and managed project management offices and provided project portfolio experience and training, etc., to clients across multiple industries, and he's a very active member of the Project Management Institute, of which he's been doing that since 1999, including serving on the board of the Lakeshore chapter for 6 years and served for 3 years as a volunteer community moderator for PMI's project program and portfolio management LinkedIn discussion group. What's great is he's been blogging weekly about project management since 2009 and has been frequently recognized in top 50 project management blog rankings. So please help me in welcoming our speaker for this session, Kiron Bondale.
Thank you, Francois. All righty, testing. Perfect. Looks like it works. Good stuff. Well, as Francois said, I've got the dubious honor of trying to keep all of you awake after lunch. Always a bit of a challenge. But what's really great is when I was sitting here up front listening to Blair and Amy, and really everyone that came up and was saying something about the need to change, Agile as a term, as a way of thinking, as a mindset came up again and again and again. So in a way, this feels like I'm playing to an audience that's already been warmed up, which is excellent. This is the perfect place for a speaker to be. So let's see if I can get my clicker here working. Clicker, there we go. I was thinking about, well, what would be a really good image to use for this presentation? And when I was thinking about what's a catchy topic name, I said, well, Agile, we live in Waterfall, we're getting drenched, trying to be agile. And I said, you know, let me try to find a really cute photo of an elephant under a waterfall, and that was probably the best one I could find. Okay, so what are we going to be covering over the next hour or so? I want to give you guys a quick refresher on Agile, and I know that for a lot of you this is old hat, you've gone through your training, you've been on projects and so on, but I think it's important to establish a level playing field because it's quite likely there are some folks in this room for whom Agile is still conceptual, that have not had some chance to get some hands on. So I want to make sure that we do a little bit of a refresher just to get that level playing field. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Agile transformation because for each of your organizations, that might be a goal of yours over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years to transform your organizations to being more agile. And again, when I speak of agile, I'm talking agile with a small a, not necessarily pitching a given methodology or a certain set of practices, talking more in terms of how can we be more agile as organizations, as departments, as project teams. Want to look at Agile in the public sector from the perspective of a transformation to say that what are some of the enablers, some of the benefits that we see in public sector that lend themselves to Agile delivery? And then, of course, if we're looking at the good, we have to look at the bad or the challenges as well and say, well, what are some of the blockers that we might be facing that are unique to public sector that might make it more challenging to do an Agile transformation? From there, I'm going to segue into actual enablers for a successful Agile transformation. And again, for many of you, some of these will be familiar with them. Some of them might be new, or you might not have thought about them. And then recognizing that we all have to start somewhere, that we might be in a situation where organizationally, structurally, because of some of these blockers, we can't really be agile. We can't jump in with both of our feet. How can we get started? What are some tips, practices, techniques that we could apply, even if it's on traditional waterfall projects that start to move us further down that continuum? Okay, what I want to start off with is just establishing a bit of a baseline. A couple of hundred people, I think, roughly in the audience here. We're just going to do a show of hands. If we'd had the clickers, that would have been great. Could have done kind of a polling on the screen. But let's maybe just do it with a show of hands. I want to try to get a sense as to where Agile awareness is in this audience. So 1, as you can see, pretty much you can spell Agile. That's about the extent of it. 2, you've gone on some training or maybe taken a course or watched a few webinars. Maybe you were a stakeholder on an Agile team. 3, you've been on many Agile teams, maybe as a team member. Maybe you've kind of had your first experience as a Scrum Master or an Agile lead. 4, you've led multiple Agile teams in the past. Maybe even you've dealt in sort of a Agile coach capacity in the past. And if you're going to raise your hand for number 5, pretty much you got to be one of the people that back in 2001 signed the manifesto. So let's start with the ones. And this is a safe crowd over here, so don't feel shy. We all started somewhere. Okay, my incredibly scientific polling says that's about 5 to 10%. Okay, let's go up to the 2s. A little bit of training, maybe a little bit of exposure, a little bit more. Okay, yeah, it's starting to get a bit more, 25, 30%. Good, good. How about 3? Lots of Agile experience on Agile teams. Starting to get down into the minority now, 2 to 5%. How about being an Agile lead Scrum Master? What are we seeing there? About the same, a little bit less maybe, 1, 2%. Any 5s? Anybody raise a hand for this? You got to come up here and deliver this presentation. I'll be the one saying we're not worthy then. Okay, so let's do a very quick review of what we mean by traditional versus Agile or Waterfall versus Agile. So when we look at Waterfall delivery, we're generally looking at those projects that are going to be delivered using a very deterministic predictive type approach. They're those projects where we believe things are not going to change. We're going to nail everything down up front or early on in the life of those projects. We don't need to have that continuous involvement of our customers. And many times it could be those are projects where we're only going to realize the value in a big bang manner. There is no opportunity to deliver value early and deliver value regularly. So the example I use here is if we wanted to set up a theme park somewhere in the Greater Toronto area, we wanted to compete with what's available up north in Canada's Wonderland. One way to do it would be to do that very deterministic approach, essentially plan it all up front, deliver it, big bang, it's there. But a different way to do it is if we wanted to look at it more as an evolutionary or an adaptive approach. If we recognize that our needs, our requirements, environmental conditions, market pressures, those are going to induce change, and we want to start to embrace change versus trying to control it rigidly and shy away from it. And if we'd like to achieve value sometime before the absolute end game, then this is where more of an Agile delivery approach might work. So in this case, we still have the same end goal. We still want to create that theme park, but maybe we just don't know if there's enough of a market for it. So we want to get our toes wet. And maybe what we start off with is the little painted ponies on the little merry-go-round thingy, the carousel, whatever it's called there. Maybe we start with that. Then we layer on maybe a few more kind of opportunities for people to provide us feedback. And then finally, when we know it's a real viable opportunity, do we go whole hog on the investment and deliver? So what are our key benefits? What are we hoping to achieve with Agile delivery? A few here that you're well aware of, and a few that I'll talk about that maybe aren't as prominent in people's minds. So really the first one, the one that we really want to talk about the most, is the business value. Incremental business value delivery, deliver early, deliver regularly. Why is that important? Well, a couple of reasons that's important is we can't afford to be tying up investment dollars for too long. We've got citizens, we've got our clients, we've got internal clients that are saying there's major opportunity costs, there's major other areas we could invest in, show me the money. In fact, I often like to say, from a project manager perspective, one of the benefits of Agile delivery compared to a traditional delivery approach is how do we retain engagement from our sponsors? Our sponsors are really busy people, depending on where they're positioned within our organizations. If they're ADMs, if they're DMs, whatever they might be supporting and sponsoring multiple projects. If your project is going to go quarters or years before it delivers value, how are you retaining their interest? It's that what have you done for me lately? Agile delivery is a great way to answer the what have you done for me lately question. Something I heard earlier today in a couple of the presentations was around risk. One of the benefits of Agile delivery is that we don't shy away from risk. We embrace risk, we bring it earlier in the life cycle, so that way if we're going to fail, we fail fast, we fail cheap. We embrace change, we don't shy away from it. So in almost no project these days can we say that nothing changed from the get-go. Recognizing that change is a constant, how do we embrace it? And then finally, the most important thing, how do we provide that visibility to our stakeholders, our customers, other partners, delivery teams, control partners, those kind of folks? How do we give them that visibility they want? So those are, I mean, the very obvious benefits. But let's take it beyond that. Let's look at the human side. In her keynote speech or presentation this morning, Amy spoke about the people factor. People is really the most important thing about Agile from my perspective, on two levels. One of them is engagement. If we're successful at transforming our organization delivery to an Agile delivery approach, it's talking about empowering people. It's talking about self-organizing teams, self-managing teams. It's talking about giving people an opportunity to start to see gratification and results more frequently. When we do our demos, we do our reviews at the end of every iteration or sprint, one of the practices I always tell people is don't make that something that the Scrum Master is doing, or that your solution lead is doing, or that your business analyst is doing. Share the wealth. Give everybody an opportunity, sprint over sprint, to have their 15 minutes of fame in the limelight. That's great for motivating people. In fact, Harvard Business Review about a year ago published an article on Agile, and one of their main findings was that employee engagement in organizations that have gone through an Agile transformation successfully, employee engagement and satisfaction is much higher. So that is one of the benefits that we see. But let's think of another one. Let's think of it from a competitive advantage perspective. So here in the OPS, we're certainly a valued employer. A lot of people coming out of school, coming to Canada, coming to Ontario, might be looking at the OPS as a place they'd like to work. But it's not the only employer. There are other employers out there. And so in terms of competing for talent, when we think about those kids that are graduating out of college, graduating out of university, folks that are coming from other countries that might be used to a more Agile delivery approach, that's what they're learning. They've been trained on that in school and in university. Sure, they might have learned conceptually or theoretically about traditional waterfall delivery approaches, but the way they're delivering their projects, the way they're doing their co-op work terms is through Agile. And so if they join our organizations and we're telling them that, yeah, you're going to have to fill out these 5 documents in triplicate, and oh, by the way, to get a decision made, you got to go up through 4 levels of management, and the code that you write today will not go into production for 9 months. We're not going to be able to attract and retain them. So that's another factor to consider, is that when we think about competitive advantage, getting the right talent to be able to drive results and to be able to move the dial, we need to move in this direction. So again, I mean, quick recap there for most of you. You'll notice that as we look at Waterfall versus Agile, we're looking at really upending the iron triangle. Rather than the focus being on locking down our scope, locking down our requirements, and letting there be some flexibility, either naturally or through change orders on cost and time. On Agile projects, if we're constrained cost-wise, time-wise, then we understand. We let our features be the flexible variable. And I think all of you have read the manifesto values, but the reality is the manifesto for Agile software development was written for that context, software development. Now, many of you are working in the technology space. That's great. Software development might be your bread and butter. But for many of us, we're not working in that space. Does that mean Agile doesn't work? No. It means we need to adapt it. And so maybe we need to look at taking some liberties with the value statements in the Agile manifesto. Maybe we need to be focusing on working solutions rather than working software, and recognizing that we're not dealing in that simple use case, that Agile sweet spot of just one customer that's paying our bills, but we're dealing with multiple different stakeholders We want to be focusing on stakeholder collaboration, bringing together all their voices, understanding change as it happens. Okay, so what do we mean by an agile transformation? So this morning, Amy had spoken about a digital transformation. Well, what's an agile transformation? So one way we could think about an agile transformation is this. It's the one that probably many of you are thinking about, is moving our delivery practices for our portfolios, either at a departmental level or at an enterprise organizational level within our ministries, within our clusters, from traditional to agile delivery. That could be one form of an agile transformation. But is that it? How about this? Had a great discussion with Deborah at my table this morning about this. Is, for many of us, how we deliver change is through projects. But let's think back to our PM 101 training. For those of you that got your PMPs, you'd have had to study this. Tuckman's ladder. Remember the phases of Tuckman's ladder? Audience participation time. What's the first phase? Come on, someone's got their PMP recently. Tuckman's ladder, stages of team evolution, team growth. One, forming. Okay, second one, storming. Third one, norming. Performing. I'll pause on that one, performing. That's where we want to take our teams, right? As project managers, as project sponsors, even as project team members, we would love to jump into performing. But what is it that we learn when we take a course on project management or on organization behavior or team building? You can't short-circuit the process. You have to go through the preceding phases. The problem with project-centric is that every few months, every year or so, as our projects start and end, we're taking our team of cross-functional team members through forming, storming, norming, getting into performing for a period of time, and then we tear them apart. Moving to more of a product-centric, service-centric, capability-centric model is one way to ensure we stay in performing. If we look at metrics like velocity on agile projects, the expectation is as the team grows, gels, becomes better, velocity is going to increase. It might plateau at some point, but it'll increase. The problem is if we're constantly forming and reforming our teams, we hit a much lower velocity plateau than we would if we allowed ourselves to stay product-centric. That's one reason product-centric is important. But another reason is domain knowledge. Many different solutions, many different business processes, and if we keep moving people around project to project to project, they don't have the chance to develop that deep awareness of those processes, those applications, those stakeholders. Product-centric increases that knowledge. So that could be another way that we think about an agile transformation, is looking at the services that we provide, looking at the solutions that we support, and saying, well, which of these do we consider to be our crown jewels? These are the ones that maybe we want to adopt that product-centric approach. How about this one? I think I heard earlier this morning that sort of statement about, well, I've got 3 to 7 projects on my plate. Not alone. That's not only public sector. Private sector's got the same challenge. Too much going on. One of the challenges of the increased interest in project management, the projectization of things, if you will, is that if everything is a project, we never have enough staff to deliver all those projects. And if we can't get better at resource capacity management, enterprise resource management, then there's that assumption that we have infinite capacity, which means let's start to push more and more and more projects through. So part of an agile transformation might be going back to those basic principles that we learn in grade school, cut your coat according to your cloth. Figure out what your effective throughput is at a given point in time, and then only start off as many projects at that point in time as you can successfully deliver concurrently. That might be part of your agile transformation, because one of the difficulties that I see, whether it's public sector or private sector, is organizations that have started down this journey of agile transformation, they are not happy starting a single project off. They want 3 or 4 or 5 projects that are going to be done leveraging agile principles and practices. Well, the difficulty that they hit happens almost on the first day. Who do they have that they can dedicate to those projects? Put aside even some of the secondary roles on teams. Let's look at some of the core team members and core roles. Can they dedicate a product owner? Can they dedicate an Agile lead or Scrum Master? Can they dedicate the analysts and the developers and the architects and the testers? If they can't, how do you get predictability? How do you get that osmosis, that information sharing that needs to happen? So we're kind of failing right out of the gates if we can't do that. But the only way to do that is to only start as many concurrent projects as we can effectively staff. And here's another one. So again, at my table, we were having a brief discussion around DevOps. DevOps is a big buzzword. It's hard to go to almost any conference these days where somebody will not stand up and say, I've got the answer to DevOps, usually a tool vendor of some kind. Well, this is also part of an Agile transformation, because if all we do is get better at delivering solutions, but we don't actually implement those solutions, we don't actually push the change out into our operating production environments, if we don't improve how our operational support staff, how quickly they come up to speed, that is going to drag out the time for value realization. And so we also need to consider, how do we go about breaking down the walls between development and operations? So all four of these really are what I consider to be an Agile transformation. So if the focus in your organizations had just been on the first one, you might want to also consider, how do you start to make some inroads on the remaining three? So let's talk a little bit about now how we can approach an Agile transformation. Whether that's within your department, whether that's at a broader organizational level. The right way, I believe, has to start here. It has to start with mindset. The reason we need that is Agile is a different way of thinking. It's not just a different way of doing. We need to embrace a different way of thinking about value delivery, engagement with our stakeholders, working with our team members, structuring our projects. That has to start with mindset. The analogy I like to use is learning a new language. You know that you are actually proficient in a new language when you think in that language. If you're still thinking, for example, for those of you that are learning French, let's say, if you're still thinking in English and translating to French when you speak, you haven't really embraced the language. You need to think in French. The same is true here. We need to be thinking Agile to be Agile. We can't just be practicing Agile to be Agile. Mindset is the foundation. Mindset, though, is the hardest thing to be able to cultivate. It's really easy for me to send a group of team members on a course, and they can learn practices. Or we can go out and buy a suite from version 1 or from Atlassian or Rally or some other company and implement that. And that's really easy. The hard thing is changing people's minds. That takes time, that takes effort. And that's why Agile transformation is not a sprint, no pun intended. You're not going to get there within a month or a quarter or a year. I would say organizations within the OPS, you're looking at a 2 to 5 year journey minimum. And a large part of that is the mindset change. Given my druthers, I would actually say before you even start to look at introducing Agile practices or bringing in a methodology, focus purely in the waterfall context, but try to elevate the mindset to adopt an Agile mindset. Start there. Once that mindset is set, then we start to see behaviors start to kick in. Behavioral change happens. That's the next thing we want to work on. How do we get behavioral change happening? Really easy way to do that, easy I say, somewhat costly, time-consuming, is coaching. Coaching, either internal coaching or bringing in external coaches to help out. They can observe the behavior, they can coach to the behaviors. Only when we start to see the behaviors reflecting what we want to see happening on our projects to being Agile, that's where I recommend starting to introduce the practices. And then finally, when you start to see practices being followed with the right behaviors and mindset, then you can move to tools and methodology. So this pyramid structure also does reflect where I believe the effort needs to be placed. Focus on mindset and behavior, then on practices, then finally tools and methodology. Unfortunately, in many organizations, what I've seen is the opposite. And given a few of the chuckles, I'm getting the sense that it might not be an alien experience for some of you. Sometimes we jump right to methodologies and tools. And oftentimes, I mean, I work for a vendor. Sometimes we are to blame for this. The vendors will come out there and say, we're going to make Agile easy for you. Buy our off-the-shelf methodology. Buy some tools we have. They will help you be Agile within 90 days. So we buy into that. Sometimes it's our executives, our sponsors. They have read an article on Agile. They've had a peer of theirs talk to them about it, and they want to jump on the bandwagon. And one of the easiest ways to demonstrate that you're doing something in the Agile space is by investing in methodologies and tools. The problem, though, is if we just drop in those methodology and tools and we haven't addressed the mindset, the behavior, or the consistent practices, what you start to see is we're basically having dysfunction just with a new set of toys. You see a lot of inconsistency. For example, we put in some sort of an Agile planning or requirements management product. And if we haven't really focused on those mindset behaviors and consistent practices, what happens? Well, you start to see 2 or 3 different teams that are figuring out their own ways to track requirements. Some teams are doing it at too low a level. Some teams at too high a level. Traceability's gone out the window. Then our friends, the auditors, drop by, look at what's being captured, and they say, wait a minute, basic control objectives are not being met. Or you see teams where they're using tools like Jira, they've put in their stories, but what happens? At the beginning of every sprint, the project manager is standing up saying, Bob, this is going to be your story. You need to do this. And every day, they're bugging Bob. Are you done yet? Are you done yet? Are you done yet? So they're using the tools. They seem to be following sprint-like structure, but they haven't embraced the mindset. They haven't followed the practices. After some time, those organizations recognize we want some consistency. So they'll try to introduce some consistent practices. The problem is we've got consistent practices, but we're still not embracing it. Finally, they recognize that's where they needed to have focused: behavior and mindset. So let's talk a little bit about the public sector. What do we see as being advantages? What advantages do we have when it comes to Agile delivery? Well, first of all, fixed and constrained budgets. It's not as easy as it is in the private sector to just pick up the phone and say, yeah, I'm going to need an extra $10,000. Those budgets are handed to you oftentimes on your projects. Once annual planning has been done, once those budgets have been set, that's it. You're handed a dollar value. At that point, to turn around and get an increase on that usually is a very onerous process. That encourages looking at other areas for flexibility, scope being one of those. We have highly visible projects. We have release dates that can't move. We're time constrained. Once again, you put cost constraint and time constraint together, what lever do we have left? Scope and requirements. There's well-defined strategy and there's multi-year capability roadmaps. As it stands, that should start to create that impetus, that desire to look at the product management function, really start to invest in good quality product roadmaps. We need to embrace change because we know there's shifting priorities. We have some very strategic vendor partnerships, some very large vendors that we work with, many that are a lot of experience in the Agile space. That's a benefit. And we have kind of the double-edged sword when it comes to public consultation. On one side, it's that great opportunity to be able to get your feedback, get a lot of feedback from a really important stakeholder group. On the other hand, sometimes that could drag out the process. That could introduce a large amount of delay. We might not be able to deliver as early and as regularly as we want if every release we have to involve public consultation. Bit of a double-edged sword. That's the good. Here's some of the challenges, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Heavy, heavy reliance on outsourcing. Now, it's not to say that outsourcing or bringing in third parties is bad. It's oftentimes that necessary evil, the means to an end. But when we think about Agile delivery, and especially as we look at long-lived teams, product-centric delivery, we want to be creating teams where there's a strong amount of gelling, where there's loyalty, where there's knowledge, institutional knowledge, organizational knowledge, process knowledge. It's hard to do that when we've got a lot of consultants and contractors. Oftentimes, those consultants and contractors are bringing their own processes, their own standards, their own practices, versus developing a standard set that we use within our departments. Heavy regulatory constraints, procurement being a great example of that, that introduces that many more control partners, that many more stakeholders. It's not as easy as at the end of your demo or review, at the end of your sprint, getting sign-off from your customer. You actually have got to go through multiple layers of stakeholders to be able to put change out there. That creates some delays. In OPS, it takes a village to deliver a project, right? It's not a case where one individual, one small team can deliver change. There's many delivery partners that you have to work with. It's a federated delivery model. In that context, we might want to be as agile as we want, but if we're dealing with a delivery partner that wants to live in Waterfall, Agile is a good example of that chain where it's the weakest link. If our weakest link is saying, we can't handle this, we need a fully fleshed out requirements document, sometimes we've got to play ball with that to deliver value. Labor contracts can be a challenge. Not to say that you cannot be agile in a unionized environment, but you want to try to get in on the ground floor. As those contracts are being inked, you want to be there because there needs to be some flexibility, versatility around job roles, what people will do, the activities they'll incur. That can become challenging. If you're walking into a situation where there isn't that flexibility, where you don't have that opportunity to revisit those contracts, you could find yourself in trouble with the union very fast. And we do have these challenges of hierarchical decision making. That's one of the biggest issues of Agile in government, whether that's at the provincial level, federal, even at the municipal level, is that it's rare to find a single individual that A, is empowered, B, has the necessary knowledge, and C, has the necessary or the availability of time to be able to make decisions in a rapid enough fashion to enable Agile teams to deliver early and regularly. Maybe I'll pause for a minute. Any others that we're aware of? Good opportunity for audience participation. What other challenges have you encountered with Agile? Here we go, if we can get a mic down there.
So you mentioned fixed and constrained budgets. They are a benefit. I didn't get that. I thought they are a challenge.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I'm a cup is half full kind of person. The benefit of a fixed timeline, fixed cost is we need to look at flexibility somewhere. As project managers, if we're handed fixed cost, fixed time, and fixed scope, we should be throwing our hands up saying something's got to give. And so if you're telling me that there's no give on budget, there's no give on timelines, or we've made commitments to certain stakeholders around certain milestones, that's where scope is the flexibility. That's which encourages then use of a more agile delivery approach where we prioritize the features we're going to deliver, maybe strive to that 80% solution versus the perfect solution that way.
So that's a challenge, right? Because we have fixed and constrained budgets, we have fixed release dates, but scope is not necessarily a flexibility. If we have to deliver something to the public, say if we have a tax change which is to be implemented on the web, that's a fixed scope. So if you have fixed cost and so if the scope is fixed and if you have a fixed budget and time, that's a challenge, not a benefit, I see.
No, so again, scope as in the what? Sure, that might be fixed, but rarely is it fixed at a detailed how level. And that's where we could start to look at, is there a Honda solution that we can go with within those cost and time constraints, and then work in the future towards the Cadillac solution. Sometimes we predetermine the solution. We allow ourselves as project managers, as project teams, to get handed a solution versus truly understanding what is the need that needs to be satisfied. If we leave ourselves flexible there, there might be many ways to skin that proverbial cat. Okay. Any other challenges, though, that we would see? Oh, back of the room over there.
This one is not specific to Agile, but I would call it talking heads. Lack of walk the talk.
Yes.
We hear even today, yeah, this doesn't make sense, we have to change it. And nothing gets done, and we hear it year over year, right? And then once you have people saying, yeah, we have to do it, they are hitting the wall because they don't have the support from their managers or from the higher ups, right? Everybody agrees that this is something we have to change, and nothing happens.
Yeah, and that's the behavior and mindset. It really comes back to that, is that when I talk about behavior and mindset change, I'm not talking about that at a team level only. It permeates the organization. So whether that's at a department level or whether that's organization-wide, we want to see behavior and mindset changes across the board. Because as I said, we don't deliver our projects just within the context of a team. If the delivery partners, the control partners, our sponsors, our key stakeholders, if they are all not buying into this different way of working together and delivering value, it is going to fail. Good. Okay, let's move along. So what are the enablers that I view as being Agile? And really I'm going to use that term being Agile. That's where we want to get to, not doing Agile, we want to be being Agile. The first one, it's a bit of a mouthful. We want our teams to be empowered. Empowered to be able to make decisions, empowered to figure out the right way to get their work done within organizational standards, policies, and regulations. That's the key. It's finding that sweet spot between Agile, do whatever you want, which simply will not work in public sector, or Agile, but with a whole bunch of constraints around it. That sweet spot is understanding what is a policy and a regulation that we cannot break, we have to live with it. What is a standard that maybe we can influence, that we can challenge, that we can say, why are we doing this? Can we modify that? We want self-organized teams. Self-organized teams are not sitting there waiting to be told what to do. They have the confidence to be able to figure out the right way to deliver value. But they're self-disciplined about that. Self-discipline is extremely important. Agile is a more disciplined way of delivering value than Waterfall, because the runway's a lot shorter, and there's many more pairs of eyes looking at your team than Waterfall. Self-awareness, we want those long-lived teams. That goes back to the product-centric model I spoke about. But most importantly, if I only had one adjective to keep up there, it would be psychologically safe. This is so, so important, and it is such a challenge for many organizations, whether it's public sector or private sector. Google has proven that psychological safety, #1 determinant of high-performing teams. Psychological safety is all about, do we feel safe to take chances? Do we believe that we can fail small and it won't be held against us? Can we be authentic, can be ourselves, can we be vulnerable without being persecuted for that? It's easy to say that, but it's really hard to practice that on a team. Simple case in point, we're having our daily stand-up, our scrum. One of the team members says, didn't make as much progress as I could have yesterday because I got distracted with something. Now, if the whole team is supportive, that's great. The person will recognize that all of us are human beings, we have weaknesses, we make mistakes. They will dust themselves off and move on, and they'll be successful the next day. But if the sponsor happened to be sitting in on that stand-up and said something critical about that individual or chastised them, the team's lost its psychological safety. Psychological safety is what allows teams to hit the higher levels of innovation and creativity. We want to encourage that. Make it safe to fail. This is another challenging one for us. It's that willingness to develop generalizing specialists. Moving from those I-skilled to the T-skilled resources of Agile. This doesn't mean that we're suddenly taking on whatever roles we feel like. It's when it's in the best interest of the team for us to try something different. If we have the ability to contribute, we contribute. That jack of all trades, master of one. But that's challenging, because in a matrix structure, if your people manager, your functional manager is evaluating you based on your functional title and a job family or job description that is very rigid, where do we allow for that generalizing specialists? We need to have sufficient coaching, not just for the Agile teams. A lot of organizations will spend the money bringing in external coaches to spend time with the Agile teams. That's great. But what about our leadership? What about our functional managers? That's where we need to get those benefits of behavioral change. Coaching has to be at all levels, not just at the team level. We need to look at some of our policies and some of our standards. Agile is not purely a delivery-driven discipline. It also requires support from many of the support areas in our organizations, human resource policies, procurement policies. We want to align them to Agile delivery. Procurement, for example, oftentimes the temptation is to say, well, let's lock in this very long-term deal to be able to save a few dollars. We need to look at changing that. Do we have early termination clauses in our procurement practices? Do we always bake those in? Are we looking when we go to market for vendors that align with our desired delivery approach? Or are we picking the cheapest vendor? From an HR perspective, how do we find that balance between individual and team? If performance evaluations, individual recognition, they're all focused on what you do as a sole contributor, then we're not incenting development of true team spirit and team behaviors. We need to try to find that balance. We want to also get our delivery and our control partners and our vendors all aligned with us. Bring them along for the journey. Control partners like risk and audit and privacy and security, we want to make sure they understand that Agile isn't making things less secure or less safe, but we also need them to understand that they can't have the same practices and staffing models for those projects as they had in the traditional space. They would need to be along with us for the journey through our Agile projects because things will be changing. And here's the one that's usually the biggest sticking point, the dedicated primary roles within Agile teams. Not all roles, because if we think about all the work items we have in our backlogs, maybe we don't need to have every single team member there 100% of the time. But there's probably a small critical set that absolutely need to be there all the time. They're involved in 100% of the work items in our backlogs. If that's the case, we need them to be dedicated, which goes back to that Agile transformation variant of only start off enough projects that you can staff. If we can't do that, we can't have those dedicated primary roles. So this is a pretty tall order. It's a really long list for us to try to work through. And we might not be able to do most of these. I mean, maybe a quick show of hands. How many of you believe that in your departments, you're hitting all of these? Anyone? There you go. So that's the challenge. To truly be Agile, we need to hit all of these. So what happens if you can't hit these? Well, one way to start to get into the right practice is to say, even if we're still on a waterfall project, what could we adapt? What could we start to gain confidence and knowledge and awareness on? And that's what I want to take us through, is the list of what are those practices, those techniques that we learn off in the Agile context that maybe we could apply to our traditional projects. How about this one, daily stand-ups? Are daily stand-ups only restricted to Agile projects? No. We could do them on waterfall projects. Think about that. If you can take 10 minutes or 15 minutes out of your team's time on a daily basis to make sure everyone is focused in the right direction, to make sure that blockers are being brought to your attention in a very timely manner, versus waiting to the end of a week or every 2 weeks to have an hour or 2 hour long project team meeting, why not do that? Daily stand-ups in place of weekly or bi-weekly team meetings. Certainly can be done on any type of project. How about this one? We learn in every project management course we take that start with the end in mind. If we don't define what success means at the very beginning of a project, how are we going to know at the end of it whether we delivered what we needed to? So when we look at our deliverables and work packages, why not adapt the concept of the definition of done? In the same way as we have our teams come up with a definition of done for the work items that they are going to be completing, think about it in terms of our deliverables and work packages. Let's say you're on a traditional project and you are developing a work breakdown structure. As you break it down to that work package level, work package by work package, ask the question, how do we know that we're done? Get that information, get that concurrence right there. It'll save you grief later on. Retrospectives. Any good reason we couldn't do these on waterfall projects? No. Should do them on any type of project. Why do we wait to the end of a phase, the end of a release, the end of a project to capture those lessons learned? First of all, on many of our big projects, if we wait that long, you've probably lost some of your team members. They probably moved on to some other project. And if you as the project manager weren't proactive enough to kind of bend their ear to get a sense as to what they might have learned and captured that, those lessons have left. If I wait 6 months, 9 months to do my lessons learned, on top of that, are people going to really remember the valuable stuff? They're going to remember the really bad and the really good, but they're not going to remember some of those more subtle lessons. And the third reason for this is that if we wait to the end, to a major milestone, we wait to a phase, we wait to the end of a project, you may not be helping your own project. When you capture those lessons, they're helping some future hypothetical project. Frequent retrospectives, on the other hand, even on a waterfall project, means we could learn things that we could apply right away to help our own projects. Kanban boards are another practice, another tool that we can use regardless of the nature of our projects. I mean, Kanban is a work management philosophy. Doesn't necessarily have to be used just on Agile. Even on waterfall projects, you could do it. So as project managers, let's say that looking at our Gantt charts, we figured out, okay, here's the next 30 days worth of activities. One way we can go about it, the traditional way, is starting to assign that out to our team members, pulling those filters out of Microsoft projects, sticking them into email messages or discussing them with the team. Here's the activities I want you to work on. But maybe a simpler way to do it would be to just take those same activities, create the Post-it notes for them, stick them up on a Kanban board, let the team members take ownership for their tasks. And then instead of myself as the project manager staying on top of those team members to say, are you done, are you done, are you done yet? I just have to look at the Kanban board and I know immediately what the status is. Which activities have we completed, which we haven't started, which ones are maybe stalled, that maybe I as the project manager need to jump into to help accelerate. Extreme programming brought forward the idea of pairs programming, and then that was extrapolated to a practice known as mob programming. Well, does that really need to only apply in software development? Pairs programming, if you kind of scratch the surface, is just a type of non-solo work. A couple of benefits of non-solo work. We're improving quality. We're getting it right the first time. We're also building bench strength. So instead of having these pockets of knowledge within our teams, individual subject matter experts, if we start to pair people up to do different types of activities, requirements work, design work, development work, testing work, we start to get more bench strength. So that way, if maybe our lead hitter is sick for the day, we have a pinch hitter that can jump in. The team isn't dead in the water. So non-solo work can apply regardless of the type of project, waterfall or agile, regardless of the nature of the project, technology or not. Here's a really important one. Even if I'm delivering a project using a waterfall approach, there's still likely a cadence. There's still likely some sort of a priority to how we're going to work on features and requirements. So why not think about prioritizing your requirements based on risk? One way could be prioritizing purely based on value. That's great. Our customers, our stakeholders get the value. But then we hit that risk. That risk is realized late in the game with that one work item that no one wanted to tackle. Then our projects go red and stay red. Well, how about moving risk earlier in the life cycle? In Agile, we learn about this term information radiators. Information radiators are a way of sharing information. It's a pull method of learning things. Instead of my having to pull together a group of stakeholders for a status review or sending out a deck to 30 people, half of whom aren't going to read it, why don't I start to take advantage of these information radiators? Post up useful information about our project. Risks are a great example. As good project managers, all of us are populating our risk registers and keeping those risk registers current. But how many of our stakeholders actually know where that risk register is? How many of them look at those risk registers? Instead, if we just extracted the top 5 or 10, posted them in a highly visible place, either online on a dashboard or if we're co-located in a war room, now they're front and foremost in people's minds. Regular demos with stakeholders. Again, not restricted to Agile. Engage your stakeholders. Show them what you're doing. Prototyping, storyboarding, different techniques to start to get that feedback throughout the life cycle. This is a really important one. Don't let Agile be the catalyst for moving to leaning out your delivery processes. Look at your processes from a third-party view. Step outside the project for a moment and say, does every piece of information we're asking our team members to enter, is it actually adding value? If it's not, why are we doing it? Ask the question why. Constantly challenge the standards. If they're too heavy, if they're one size fits all, if there isn't scalability in your artifacts, why is there not? So with that, I think we're down to about 3 or 4 minutes. Thought I would pause for any questions. One thing I will mention is that if you're interested in learning more about Agile, you're still sort of in that 1 and 2 range there in my scale. We do offer courses on Agile. We have a 3-day hands-on workshop, Pragmatic Agile. For the participants of the conference, there is a discount if you get in touch with us by the end of November. So just feel free to send me an email to info@wcpconsulting.com. More than happy to share that discount code with you if you'd like to get some PDUs in before year end. With that, I'll pause, see if there's any questions. Question right over here.
First of all, thank you so much for delivering wonderful presentation. Thanks. I'm also a member of Lakeshore chapter of PMI. And my question is, I'm actually glad that you presented slide number 15, because slide number 10 made me scratch my head. It sounded like it is impossible to go Agile while you're going to Agile, right? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So to be Agile, you have to go through that journey. And as I said, I really would hope the journey starts with the mindset and behavior. But recognizing that, at the end of the day, we need to think as project managers, we're like Batman. We have a tool belt with a bunch of tools on it. We need to know the wisdom of pulling out the right tool for the right context. Agile gave us a whole bunch of new tools and techniques and practices and ideas. If we know we're stuck in Waterfall, why can we not leverage some of those that are applicable? That way we start to build a confidence within ourselves that when we get to that stage where we have the right star alignment to be Agile, we're already confident with those tools and techniques, and we're also developing that confidence within our team members. That way.
Yeah, and one more thing I wanted to highlight, you also mentioned on your slide 15, Kanban boards, start using those. I believe one of the benefits for Kanban boards is limiting work in progress.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Really great comment there. Certainly the benefit of Kanban. One of them is the visualization of work. Another one is allowing people to take ownership for their work versus it being assigned to them. But the third one is definitely that concept of limiting your batches, limiting your inventory, work in progress, seeing the work flow. It becomes very visible. If you can say, well, I've only got X number of a particular type of role, limit the amount of work based on the capacity of that type of role, that'll ensure your work flows a lot smoother. Definitely one of the benefits of Kanban. Any other questions? Question in the back.
Not as much a question, but a comment. It's important to remember that Agile is not an answer to every project. There are situations where Agile is the right way to go, and there are others that Waterfall is the way to go, same with blockchain, DevOps, and all of those new concepts. So there are certain criteria where Agile makes perfect sense, but it doesn't mean that every project from now on should be Agile and that every organization needs to be 100% Agile.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I would say with the exception of very few companies that are focused on a single product, single market, all those stars are aligned, I don't believe there's any company out there that says they're going to be 100% waterfall, 100% agile. The unfortunate thing is many organizations will develop their methodologies to be sort of that door one or door two. Perform some sort of profiling on your project based on whatever the expert system spits out. Your project is well suited for waterfall, well suited for agile, and you have to follow the methodology as is. The reality is it's a continuum. Waterfall to agile is a continuum. Based on the context of your project, the team, the stakeholders, it'll fall somewhere on that continuum. And for us as project managers, we need to understand how to tailor our approach and the practices to fit the needs of our projects.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.